Hello there. This is Andrew Colsky with Stop My OCD. And today I'm very excited to have Felice Becker, who is going to tell us what it's like to be the loved one of someone with OCD. And there's a lot to talk about here. So I'm excited to get started. So Felice, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, okay. My name is Felice Becker, and my husband is a sufferer of OCD, and he has many different themes, as most people with OCD suffer from. So it's been it's been difficult. I'm not gonna lie.
Mhm. Well, I appreciate you being here to share your story because, you know, we have a lot of podcasts of people with OCD, living with
Mhm.
OCD and sharing their story, but we don't have a lot of feedback from people who are the loved ones or the caregivers or the family
Right.
members. So can you share with us, here you are, you're living with your husband, and I'm assuming at some point something kind of clues you in that something's going on.
Yes. So my husband has suffered with anxiety off and on throughout his life. That's not something that, I was surprised about. But in 2015, after the death of his third brother, and he's had a lot of loss in his family, but after the death of his third brother, he started checking the locks and checking the lights, and it just continued to get worse, unfortunately. And thank goodness that of course, I have a minor in psychology, which just makes me dangerous, really. So, so what I did was I was like, there's something going on here that's not quite right. And I was actually lucky enough that I recognized the OCD, and the first therapist that he went to was an OCD therapist.
Wow.
So I was lucky in that sense that we didn't have to wait years and years, because I think it's what, 9 to 15 years to get an actual diagnosis of OCD. So it's really frustrating for families, loved ones, and whomever, even the sufferers, to get the proper treatment.
Hmm.
So he started doing ERP. And the therapist told me, she said, Felice, you need to educate yourself on OCD. She says, because there are people out there that truly don't understand OCD. And so I probably took it to the extreme, but that's kind of how I am. I'm an avid reader, and I do a lot of research, not just on OCD, but on other things too. I'm just a strange person in that sense.
Hmm.
So, but he went through that therapy. He started getting better. And then at the end of 2018, he started to relapse.
Okay.
And part of that was because, so his themes, he's got just right, or sometimes they refer to it as Tourettic OCD as well. Um, he's, obviously counter checker, all that kind of stuff. He also suffers from hoarding related OCD and RFID, which a lot of people are not familiar with, that which is avoidant food restrictive intake disorder. So he only eats certain foods on certain days from certain places. And with the cost of food and groceries and everything else, it's costing me a fortune. And of course, on top of that, therapy that is, you know, m- if you're lucky to find a therapist that takes insurance, you're lucky,
Oh yeah.
because that just does not happen. So I've spent a lot of money on this, and what triggered the relapse was one of our neighbors decided to drive down our street drunk and plowed into my husband's truck.
Mm.
And that was, it's considered a loss or whatever. um, and he can't get rid of things. So that was a big detriment to him getting not getting better, instead going the opposite. So he actually, I'm trying to think. I want to say it was the beginning of 2020. He was actually hospitalized, and it was an absolutely horrible experience. And that's another issue that we have with our loved ones, is when they are in crisis. If you take them to a hospital that does not understand OCD, you run the risk of them not getting treated properly. And they actually went to court to keep him because they didn't know what they were doing. And so I was panicking because I was like, how do I get my husband out of the hospital? And I actually reached out to Dr. Janicki, who, of course, we all know is a world renowned OCD psychiatrist, asking him, how do I get my husband out of the hospital? And I was very impressed with the fact that he responded within less than 10 minutes. And his exact words were, "It sounds like you guys have been inflicted by the ugly hand of incompetency." And this is where we run into issues. And I've reached out to various people within the IOCDF to say, hey, we've got to get information out to these psych hospitals so that our loved ones are not traumatized, because he was actually traumatized by the whole situation. And
Sure.
so he came home. He did a little better because I think he was just happy to be home. But then he just took a nosedive, and it's been bad ever since. And COVID happened, and everything else kind of shut down. And he actually hasn't left the house in 3 years.
Wow. Wow. That's
So
a
so
lot.
he's severe. And so that from the time that he gets up until the time he goes to bed, he's doing rituals. So he literally can't, he's not living his life. And this could be triggering to people, but I mean, he's at the point where he's not suicidal, but he just prays that God will take him in his sleep.
Wow.
And
So
that's a horrible situation.
yeah, that's horrible to hear. I can't even imagine what he's feeling.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I love him because, like I said, we've been together for a long time. Uh, he was not like this when we got together, obviously, because I don't know that I would actually marry someone with this situation. Not to say that people with OCD are bad or anything like that, but he would have had to been in recovery or managing his OCD
Mhm.
for me to have gone that far. Of course, this happened after the fact, and he's really struggling. And I'm trying to get. We have a guy here, somewhat local, who comes to the house. It's an intensive outpatient, so it's an IOP, and he comes to the house Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for 4 hours. And then Monday through Thursday will be virtual evening therapy. And then, of course, homework in between there as well. And then then it's a repeat for the next week. The only problem is, of course, they don't take insurance. So I have opened up a case with my insurance company to see if I can get at least some of it paid for.
Right. Right.
So,
Wow.
but
Because
he's severe. I mean, and even the closest OCD hospital to us is 5 hours away, and they don't take insurance.
oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah, so I mean, I can't even get him to leave the house. So I really need for someone to be able to come in, but it needs to be intensive because he was doing once a week, and it was going nowhere. I mean, it really wasn't.
Right. Well, that's a really hard story, and there's so many questions that I have for you to follow up
Hmm.
with here. And I'm gonna just sort of start with the one that first is sitting on the top of my head, and that is, you were describing the period of time when he was hospitalized, and you
Hmm.
said that the hospital was basically holding him there. Can
Yes.
you share with us a little bit more about what did the hospital think was going on? Why were they holding him? Fill us in on that.
Okay, so unfortunately, the psychiatrist on staff had the God complex. And of course, she knew everything. She would bear, I mean, I think I spoke to her twice the whole time he was in. She refused to return my phone calls. She didn't want to hear what I had to say. And, uh, but she was clueless. And in fact, I said, can you help me get him on the medication his psychiatrist prescribed? And she tried to tell me, which of course was an SSRI, and she tried to tell me that that was not first line medication for OCD. And so right there, I knew for a fact that she did not know what she was talking about. She didn't, like I said, she didn't want to talk to me. She didn't want to have anything to do with me because I think she knew that I probably knew more than her. And unfortunately, that's what you run into as well. Not all psychiatrists, just like not all psychologists, understand OCD. And it's such a sad situation because you should be able to trust a psychiatrist. You should be able to trust a psychologist to provide that
Yeah.
care, but it's not there. So I've worked with various people to try to get them to understand what we need in the OCD community. And of course, we're a tight knit community. I mean, after a while, you kind of know everybody within the small community of OCD. So, my husband's psychiatrist is not necessarily an OCD psychiatrist, but he was working under a psychiatrist that was.
Hmm.
So he could take that information back and we weren't dealing with someone that didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of partially, one of the
Mhm.
reasons that even that I'm doing these podcasts is because um, there are a lot of people out there who are
Mhm.
in the medical field or in the mental health field who just never received any training about OCD. And so they don't have any, they're not
Yes.
clued in because it's just not something that they've ever dealt with. Um, I am curious if we can kind of go back to sort of the beginning for a minute, because, for you as a loved one of someone with OCD,
Mhm.
I am really curious to talk a little bit about your experience. And what I mean by that is, let me start off with this question. Can you share with us how long had you known your husband before you realized there might be OCD going on? And
Mhm.
when you realized that it might be OCD, did you engage in compulsions with him, or how did you react to it?
So, okay. So we started dating back in 19 1990. But we didn't get married until 2002. So we kind of waited, wanted to make sure that everything was good. And then, of course, I knew that he had anxiety off and on, but it was nothing that stopped him from living. He did his thing, I did my thing, we did things together. Nothing was ever a real issue until 2015 after the death of his third brother. And it just really, I mean, came in fast and, just kept continuing the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I did actually end up doing some of the compulsions only because some things I just knew he couldn't do, and so I have since, lessened those. I mean, there's still some out there because unfortunately they get kind of angry when you don't do things, and sometimes it's easier just to do it. And I know that that's the wrong thing. He knows it's the wrong thing. I tell him I shouldn't do this because it's going to make you worse. And so, it's, but I mean, there's limited stuff that I do for him at
Hmm.
this point because he's so much in his head anyway to where I'm just the bad person, to be honest with you.
Wow. Wow. That's
Yeah.
hard, especially with all the work that you're doing to try to find treatment and
Yes, exactly. Well, and that's the thing. He he's so much into his head that he probably would be considered to have poor insight.
mhm.
So that makes it even more difficult.
Right. Right.
So, making decisions, um, all the things that need to be done, he can't do anything. And I
Mhm.
know that you're supposed to, I mean, if you go out there and you Google, OCD, loved ones and all that kind of stuff. It's like show compassion, show empathy, all this kind of stuff. Well, I'm kind of past that right now, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love him, but at the same time, um, it's hard for him to even appreciate the things that I do for him because he doesn't leave the house. So I have to do all the grocery shopping. I have to do all the cleaning. I have to go get food for us and all that kind of stuff. Whereas before, I mean, he mowed the yard. He did probably more of the cleaning in the house than I did, actually, to be honest with you. And all of that is just gone.
Wow. Well,
Hmm.
so, obviously it sounds like a pretty severe case that you're
Oh,
dealing.
yes.
And I'm going to ask you, to share with us if you can. Assume that, someone who is viewing this podcast is someone who's in your position. They are the
Hmm.
wife or mother or sister or caretaker,
Hmm.
someone with
Yes.
OCD. And assume they've never dealt with it before, so they don't know really what's going on.
Hmm.
What advice could you give to them in terms of what you personally have found to be the most effective things that you can do in your position?
So, everybody promotes and it almost makes me cringe, but it's like self-care, self-care, self-care. Well, so I over the last probably 6 months I've pretty much said, "You know what? I'm going to start doing stuff for me." And so that I'm not going to say self-care because I I almost hate that phrase,
Mhm.
but taking care of yourself um is important. There are different ways in which you can do self-care. It doesn't mean that you have to go here or there. It can be a matter of, sitting on the couch, scrolling through your phone or watching a video or a movie or something to that extent, just something to kind of get away. And I also highly, highly recommend that anybody whose loved one suffers from OCD, they need to have therapy themselves.
Yeah.
And I ran into a problem because the company that I work for is all EAP, EAP. Well, that's one of the things I brought up to them. I said, you do realize that, and I did try to do therapy through EAP, but the poor lady that I was seeing, she just was like, I'm sorry, Felice, I really don't know enough about OCD to really help you. And so there's definitely a gap in the system because it's one thing to find an OCD therapist for your spouse or your loved one, but it's another thing to find OCD help for yourself, for the caregiver, for the, people that are taking care of their loved ones with OCD, because we really do actually need to see someone that has enough knowledge about OCD, because you can't just say the things that you want to say to a regular therapist. I mean, especially if my husband had more of the taboo type um themes, pedophilia, OCD, or whatever, I think what was the guy's name that you had on? He had homosexual OCD.
Oh,
I
I've
mean,
had several.
yeah, I mean, you can't just go to anybody and go, well, my husband has these thoughts that he's gonna harm a child, or harm, do something wrong, do something bad or whatever, and them not think that, oh my gosh, I need to report these people to the authorities.
Hmm.
So we have to be very, very careful from that extent. And so definitely therapy. It would be nice if so I'm actually seeing an OCD therapist, which I'm having to pay out of pocket because she doesn't take insurance. But it would be nice if they offered. I do know that No CD offers kind of like an educational therapy session or whatever for loved ones. Which I do recommend. The only problem there is that we need support just as much as the person with OCD. We are not in, I would say, as much pain as they are, but we still feel pain.
Right, right. Well, actually, you raised a good point there that I was thinking about as you were talking, and yeah, there's a lot of things we can talk about related to the person living with OCD,
Hmm.
but from your perspective as the loved one, do you ever have feelings of guilt or shame related to anything about the whole situation?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I feel bad that he's suffering, so that does make me feel guilty.
Hmm.
Um, my shame is the fact that he's um, isolated himself, so nobody really knows what's going on. I do talk to his family. My family is here, and they understand, but he won't talk to anybody but myself and a therapist. And personally, I don't really want to be that only person that he talks to. It makes it kind of hard on me, to be honest.
Right. Well, and also for him, if he's only staying at home and only interacting
Hmm.
with the people that are in the house with him, that
Right.
keeps him even more isolated.
Yes, absolutely. Hmm.
Wow. Wow. So, there's another thing I want to make sure that I ask about. You said that one of the issues that he has is Tourette's OCD.
Hmm.
Is there a particular example that you could share with us?
So he does a lot of tapping, and he does like he'll say repetitive things
Hmm.
that are more, and then he does stuff with his mouth when he's doing some of his rituals, and the majority of his rituals are physical. He does have rumination,
Hmm.
where he will lay in bed for 2 hours staring at something and just going over his head, is this right, is this right, is it in the right spot, is it, always questioning, what if it's not in the right spot, well, okay. Yeah, so I feel like we have what I call landmines in the house, where certain things have to be certain places, and if they're not, then of course all hell breaks loose, so to speak.
Yeah.
So he gets very angry, and that's really pretty much the only emotion that he has these days, unfortunately.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm typically in my office working, and he'll get up, and I can hear him in the other room, yelling and cussing and screaming, and it's quite disturbing, to be honest with you. So
Hmm.
I guess I've kind of gotten used to it to where I just tone them out, which is probably bad.
Well, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of things there, and it's not
Hmm.
easy answers to some of these. I,
Right.
if you'll bear with me for a minute, just for the benefit of the audience, I want to take a second here and explain some terms to them that they may not be familiar with,
Okay.
that you're familiar with because you've been doing homework.
Yes.
But so let me just say to the audience, when we talk about Tourette's OCD or we talk about other types of OCD, real simple breakdown here. So OCD itself, typically you're going to see someone who has obsessive thoughts or obsessive doubt, and that makes them feel distressed. And as a result of the stress, they do some sort of a compulsion, and that compulsion relieves their distress temporarily until they come back to the obsessive doubt. And that's your typical cycle. Now,
Hmm.
some people may hear about something that people term pure O OCD.
Right.
And pure
Yes.
O OCD, what they mean by that is the person has these obsessive doubts, and it's not truly pure O because they do compulsions, but their compulsions are mental.
Mental.
So
Right.
worry, rumination, all these types of things, right?
Hmm.
So that's one side. Then we get to something called Tourette's OCD. And Tourette's OCD, whereas pure O focuses on the obsessive doubt, Tourette's OCD is almost as if the obsessive doubt is not a piece of the puzzle, but the compulsion is the thing that
That
stands out.
drives.
And it's
Hmm.
almost an automatic type of a response that the person has.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
And then the one other term that I'll put out there is you hear Tourette's OCD, which sounds like Tourette's, and Tourette's is a different but similar disorder
Hmm.
that is based upon tics, whether they be
Hmm.
motor tics or vocal. So motor
Right.
tic might be like
Yep.
something like that, or a vocal
Blinking.
tic might be like
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
some kind of noise. And that is treated in a similar way to OCD, but differently. There's
Yeah.
different treatments for that. So I just wanted to put those terms out there for people watching the video so they'd understand that it's not so
Yes.
simple. There's complexities to this.
There's a lot of complexities. Yes. And a lot of times they do refer to just right OCD as Tourette's OCD. And my husband is spot on with that. And in fact, probably about 6 months ago, he really got into the whole symmetry and all that kind of stuff, which before he never did. So know that the themes can change or add to what's going on in the
Mhm.
OCD world, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. That raises another question that I meant to ask you, which is, it was interesting how you described when his OCD started after the death of his, I think you said third brother, right?
Correct.
And do you know whether anyone in his family had OCD or if there was any signs of anything related to OCD prior to that?
So that's interesting because we've tried to figure that out because we all know that there's somewhat of a genetic component to it. The problem that we have is so his father passed away when he was 3, and then his stepfather passed away when he was 6. So the rest of the family, so the first 2 brothers that passed away were alcoholics.
Mhm.
So they might have actually been medicating themselves.
Self-medicating?
Yeah. And so we don't really know. But as far as we're concerned, we don't know of anybody. Now, he does have a nephew um, that I think has been misdiagnosed because they're saying that he's treatment resistant.
Mhm.
And I'm like, well, he's probably treatment resistant because he's not getting the right treatment. And we've run into that a lot with OCD. And in fact, I had a conversation with one of the EAP therapists from Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, and said, he's an actual therapist. I mean, he sees patients. And I said, look, I said, the problem is the wrong therapy can make them worse. And he tried to say, well, I think I could probably um I could probably help someone that had a mild case, but definitely not severe. Well, we need to stop those people thinking that they could possibly help someone with a mild case, because it doesn't matter. The therapy is going to be the same, whether you're mild or severe. So that kind of clued me into how insurance companies are looking at this. And it's kind of scary, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and that's something that, people who watch my videos hear me talk
Hmm.
about it all the time.
Yes.
And, it's like it's a real challenge,
Yes.
because the therapists and the psychiatrists and the psychologists, typically they are not trained about OCD in their schooling.
Nope.
So if they're going to learn about it, they have to learn about it on their own.
Hmm.
And and this is not, me being better or different than anybody else. Anyone that I know that treats OCD, all of us have spent years of
Yes.
training,
Yes.
of
Yes.
courses, of
Hmm.
consult groups, of reading books, of webinars, research,
Hmm.
on and on and on and on. And
Absolutely.
every day I learn something new. uh,
Hmm.
it's a really, to me, it's a very interesting area. But like we just talked about a little while ago, the complexities, the layers just keep going.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
and of course, my college roommate, when all this started happening, of course, I was reaching out to her and saying, hey, this is what's going on. And her specialty is eating disorders. And we started talking about the fact that, there's got to be some comorbidity here. And at the time, the IOCDF was saying, no, no, no. It's only been with that, I think, within like the last few years that they've actually come on and said, yes, there are some comorbidities to eating disorders and OCD. And so she went and took the BTTI training. So now she can treat OCD as well.
mhm.
So,
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. It's there's just so much new research is being done, new ideas that
mhm,
come out on a regular basis. Um, you find, or I can't say you, I find that when I speak to other OCD therapists,
mhm,
everybody has their own unique little twist on
mhm,
therapy
right,
of what
right.
they found that works best. The
Mhm.
core is the same, but they
Yes.
hit a little bit.
Yes.
Um, and it's I've sort of come up with my way of approaching it that I find works best for me and my patients, but
Mhm.
it's just what works for me. Other people do it a little differently
Right.
and it works well for them. It's another thing I talk to my patients about. I say, instead of focusing on trying to find the right way, why don't we accept that we're trying to find a right
A
way?
right way. Amen.
Because there could be
I
more than
agree.
one right ways.
Yes, yes. And each patient is different, and sometimes it has to be individualized, so to speak, for someone to, do what they need to do. So,
Mhm. So going back to what you and your husband have done, I hear you've tried medications, exposure therapy. Give
mhm.
us a list. What other things have you tried or done?
I've we he actually did a little bit of EMDR, because the first therapist that he saw actually had EMDR training as well.
Hmm.
He didn't find anything helpful in that whatsoever. That is strictly used for PTSD, although you can go out and Google search EMDR for OCD, and articles will come up saying that it can be used for that as well. Um, but as far as any other thing, we really, I mean, we haven't tried, and he hasn't really been willing to go. I mean, we've got a place right up the street that does TMS. I would love for him to try that.
Mhm.
Um, but of course, that requires you to get out of the house. It's not like they're going to bring the TMS machine over to the house, although that would be incredible.
Right.
But yeah, because that's a long, drawn out thing. But they've had a lot of good things come out of it. So I've got my thoughts on a lot of different things that I'm obviously don't want to publicize because it will definitely catch a lot of people's ears that don't want to hear about it. But
Mhm.
we can take that offline. But
Okay.
yeah, no, there's a lot of things that I've tried to be patient. I've tried to be caring, loving, etc. And at this point in time, I've kind of lost my compassion and empathy, which is really sad because
Mhm.
that's not the kind of person that I am. So, I do as best I can, to be
Right.
honest.
Right. And let me just stop for 1 second before we get too far past it. I just want to mention for the audience, when you talk about TMS, you're talking about transcranial magnetic stimulation. And
Correct.
real briefly, for those people who may not know what that is, it is you go into an office and they have a machine and they have kind of like a helmet that fits over your head.
Hmm.
It doesn't actually touch your head, it just fits around your head. And then they have inside, they're called coils, and the coils will generate an electrical pulse or a magnetic pulse to a certain part of your brain. So there's different coils. They use one for depression, they use something different for
Right.
OCD. And actually they're still, it's relatively new, so they're still playing around with different
Hmm.
options, different coils.
Yes.
but but that's what TMS is. So it's non-invasive. Nobody's going to be putting anything in
Correct.
you. Um, so I just want to make sure I clarified that for the audience.
Yes. Yes.
Um, there
Well, I'm
was
making your job hard, aren't I?
no, this is great. I just want to think ahead to make sure that anyone who's watching this is not going away with questions. It's like,
Right.
what did she mean? What was TMS?
What is
So
this? Yes.
yeah.
Hmm.
Um, there was another question I had for you. Oh, I know what it was. So, can you share with the audience again from your position, are you able to find any kind of support or people in similar situations out there that you can share with?
So I have a couple of friends who have adult um, family members that have OCD. So we bounce things off of each other. At one point, I was actually going to do a 501c3, and we had a pretty decent group that got together. And what we were able to do at that point was anybody that had children, they did some group things together, which was awesome because they got to meet other kids that suffered from OCD as well. But then my husband got bad, and that kind of went by the wayside. Now, a lot of the psychologists are members of a group called DOTS here in the DFW area.
Okay.
And so, like, right there, they actually got together with the IOCDF to put together the walk that we'll be having on at the end of September. So, we do kind of have people out there, but as far as support groups themselves, no. And I will tell you this, NAMI in my area does not support OCD,
Mm,
unfortunately.
wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is definitely, something that is important and that is needed.
Yes.
The biggest, one of the big fears that I have, whether it be a person living with OCD or a family member,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, is when there aren't good resources, they tend to find whatever they can find online. And the one that
Mm-hmm.
scares me the most is things like Reddit or similar places, because
Oh,
I've gone in there and I've read the posts, and it is toxic for anyone
Yes.
who's truly trying to deal with these issues. Not that the people on Reddit aren't trying to truly deal with it, they're just not effectively dealing with it. And they
Right.
get caught up in the hype. So, for
The
me, when I have
minutia.
what's that?
The minutia.
Oh yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
whenever I start with a client or a family member or whatever, I immediately tell them, if you're going into Reddit or any of these other types of groups,
Stay
you've
out.
gone for your last time. You cannot
Yes.
go anymore. Because it really has an impact, a negative impact on their ability to get past this stuff. So with that, well, but the audience doesn't know. You and I were talking about the fact that there is a need for support and a support group. And I was
Yes.
sharing that I have the support group, the free support group through Stop My OCD. And all people, whether you're someone living with OCD or a family member, caregiver, et cetera, are welcome. But we're going to try to have, a session where we focus on family members and loved ones and see how that goes. And if that works out well, maybe it'll become sort of its own group. So,
Yes.
so if anyone's watching the video and wants to join the support group, we have at stopmyocd.com, there's a calendar up for the support group. You can see when, and if there's a particular focus, it'll say. So just go ahead and visit that, and you'll see. And then we encourage you to join. There's no cost, there's no obligation. If you don't want to be there, you leave. It's just a place to find help.
Yes. And I actually shared it with, now there are some really, really good Facebook support groups. There's a spouses support group that I did post your support group in, and there are some family ones as well. And that's kind of how I came about. A lot of this stuff was one of the family groups that I was in. I have actually become very, very good friends with some of the individuals there. And so when I attended the conference in DC in 2018, it was like Facebook came alive. So it was really kind of a cool thing from that aspect, because all these years we've been talking online, but we haven't actually, seen each other in person. And so uh, it's kind of a neat thing. But there are some good groups out there, but there are some that you might want to avoid, especially for not necessarily for the loved ones, but for the people that have OCD. Those can get somewhat toxic and mean as well. But most of the people are out there to try to support each other.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is, like you said, it's a small community because,
Hmm.
not everybody has OCD, but there is a large
Exactly.
enough number that do. Um,
Yes.
and I have to think to myself that there's probably a good number of people who do have OCD, but because their therapist is not trained in it, they might be missing it and thinking that it's
Right.
generalized anxiety or something.
Hmm. Yes. Well,
So
and I can tell you that on my mom's side of the thing, I have two cousins that have OCD, and one cousin, they're brother and sister. One of them was diagnosed with schizophrenia and OCD.
oh wow.
And I asked the other sister, not the one that has OCD, I said, Has he ever had a psychotic episode?" And she's like, "Not that I'm aware of." And I said, "I think he was misdiagnosed. I think he just has OCD, period." I said, "But when people talk about their thoughts, sometimes they refer to them as voices, as to getting inaccurate diagnosis."
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And
Hmm.
it is, like we've said, because it can get kind of complex. I belong to therapists will get together and have sort of a consult
Hmm.
group where you discuss
Hmm.
cases and all. So I belong to a couple groups like that for OCD.
Right.
And, sometimes we'll get into the nuances and trying to figure out, it's like, is this OCD or is this something else, and why,
Mhm.
and what's the actual diagnostic criteria, and how does the person present? And you'll have cases where if you read the DSM of
Mhm.
what require, what are the requirements for OCD, you can check, 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 but then there's still, it's like, yeah, it meets all the requirements, but it's not. And let me try and
Right.
verbalize what, and then we talk them through. So
Mhm.
it can get pretty interesting. You can have some really interesting conversations. And the goal, obviously, at the end of the day is, so how do we help this client? Regardless
Right.
of what you
Right.
want to call it, how do we help them?
Absolutely.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah, so and that's another reason that, not only do I do the podcast, but I try to do some educational videos. And a
Mhm.
great example of that one you mentioned earlier was people who are dealing with sexual orientation OCD, because that
Mhm.
one can get really complex, because is the person struggling with their orientation, or are they not struggling but they're struggling with
Right.
OCD? And there's so many layers to that one.
Yes. Yes,
So,
there is. Absolutely. Yes.
but so tell us, what are your thoughts for your next steps? We understand it's a really difficult situation for you. We
Mhm.
understand the access to
Mhm.
care has always been a problem.
Yes.
Your husband is not leaving the house. 3 years is a long
A long
time.
time. Yes.
So
No
what's
thanks to
what's your
COVID. COVID didn't
yeah,
help, that's for sure.
right.
So what I'm, like I said, I'm in the process. Hopefully they'll approve some monies that insurance will be willing to pay, and I will have this therapist come into the house and do this intensive outpatient program that he's developed. And I mean, they do it in, I want to say, considered like North Texas all the way down to Austin. So yeah, so I mean, and it's not cheap, of course.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
yeah, yeah.
I
Wow.
don't I don't know anything that's OCD related that's not expensive, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And part of that I think is because of the enormous amounts of extra effort and training
Yes.
the
Mhm.
therapist, the psychiatrist, the treaters have to put in. And I don't think that the insurance company really gets it. It's like, oh, you're a therapist, you can do anything. It's like, well, not really.
Yes. Well, and if you listen to any of the lives with Liz, she'll tell you, if they list that they treat more than say 4 or 5 different um types of diagnosis, run.
Mhm.
Because she says there's no way that anybody could actually treat that many different types of diagnosis, and that's, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's you know, while we're talking about OCD and the complexities, you
Mhm.
could just as easily talk about some other disorder and the complexities of it.
Right.
And there are people
Yes.
that will
Mhm.
specialize in that versus,
Yes.
OCD.
Mhm.
So yeah, I would never try and go out and treat something that I'm not, you know, trained in, or,
Exactly.
yes, I have
Yes.
my license, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be knowledgeable about every single diagnosis. I know what it is, but I don't know how to treat everything as well as I know how
Right.
to treat OCD, because that's my focus.
Exactly. And we just need to get everybody else on the same page, and especially insurance companies, because and that's one of the things I explained to that guy that I talked to the other day. I said, "Look, I said they go through major, training for this specialized treatment for OCD. It's not like they get it from going to school or they learn it from somewhere else." Of course, I will say this, there's a large percentage of therapists out there that have OCD themselves that
Mhm.
treat
Wow.
OCD.
Yep, there are. Yep.
Yep.
So, this has been really, really informative and eye-opening. And I'll ask you sort of the question that I ask all my guests, which is, assume that someone is watching this video who is in a similar situation to you. They are
Mhm.
a loved one of someone with OCD, and they've never dealt with it before, and maybe they haven't had the um, time or the ability to do the amount of research that you have done.
Mhm.
What are your best tips for them? They watch this video, the video comes to an end.
Mhm.
What should they do next?
So I'm going to reiterate what my husband's first therapist said, and that is learn as much as you can about OCD because people out there truly don't understand the disorder. Um, Make sure that you have therapy for yourself and try to get them into an OCD therapist as well. Because, otherwise, I understand people can't always afford therapy because they don't take insurance. But I look at it this way: I'm putting money towards something that is going to be helpful. So I don't look at it as like I don't want to look at it. I don't want to look at it as a major expense, although some people will. But if it means their loved one gets better, it's worth every penny.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for those comments, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join with
Hmm.
us and share all of this. Like I said, it's been really eye-opening. I learn a lot from every guest that I speak to, and it inspires me to keep educating and keep putting information out
Hmm.
there. And that's sort of my commitment to the community, to try and make information available and break the stigma as best I can.
Hmm.
So with people like you helping out and doing your part, it's together, we can make this
Hmm.
happen. So
Let's hope.
yes. So thank you so much. I wish you the best of success with this new therapist that you're going to be working
Hmm.
with. And I'm sure you and I are going to continue to be in touch. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Mhm.